Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 94. I recently sat down with Joe Davis of Arcadian Winery. Joe's made some amazing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and some Syrah for over 40 vintages, mostly in the Central Coast, first with Morgan and then his own Arcadian Winery. We discussed his aha bottle, meeting the largest influence in his winemaking, moving to France, and just a bunch of wonderful stories of his time in the wine world. A reminder that I have a Patreon at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast. The link is in the show notes also. If you're enjoying the podcast, any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. It's all run independent and out of pocket. Telling a friend or sharing on social media are great ways to help out too. Here we go.
As I'm going to be debating against three guys who are big fans of higher alcohol wines. Mm-hmm. But that was fine. And they, you know, what I recall about that as I arrived into the studio was that they wanted me to say that that was a subjective opinion rather than an objective opinion.
Okay.
That beauty was in the eye of the beholder. And I was saying, objectively, no. You know, when you have elevated levels of pH and lower acid, you require a lot more sulfur to protect those wines. There's a greater risk of bacteria spoilage. And that's, you know, objectively a risky way to make wine, at least in my assessment. Now, I had been making Chardonnay and Pinot Noir since the early 80s.
Yeah.
So, you know, I came up in a time when you couldn't get high alcohol. If a wine was over 14%, it was rare. Yeasts at the time couldn't tolerate something beyond 14%. They would typically poop out. And the level of what was considered to be dry was higher. If it was under 0.5%, 0.3, 0.4, that was considered totally dry. Because, you know, if you picked at, say, 24 bricks, back then the conversion was, I think, 0.51. So you multiply 24 by 5.1, that gives you potential ethanol.
Right.
And today now it's 0.63 or 0.64. So they're picking at the same number. They're picking at 24 and you multiply by 0.63. Now you've got well over 14%. And we've seen wines north of 17%.
Yeah.
You know, Williams & Cellier made a Jack Castill Zinfandel that was, I think, 18.2, 18.1%.
Yeah, that's
alcohol.
amazing for a non-fortified wine.
Right. And so I've seen, you know, Greg Brewer Clifton, the early years, I saw that, you know, Chardonnays that were 17% alcohol for their wines. I just never was my style, but objectively, it didn't make a lot of sense because it is riskier. When you have those, when you're picking at those really high ripe numbers of 30 bricks or something, you know, pHs are going to be through the roof, 4.0.
Yeah.
Wines are not going to hold color very well. Acids are going to be pretty low. So they're, in my estimate, out of balance. Now, winemakers can add acid.
Right.
They can water back to, you know, if they ferment it out and it's 17% alcohol, they can add some water back to lower the alcohol if they want to. But I think, why do that? You know?
Yeah. Do you think that's incompatible with kind of the longer barrel aging regime that you
certainly
what you do also?
Yeah, certainly, because those wines evolve and oxidize at a much more rapid rate. And so if you're going to, say, harvest in September and bottle in June or July, you probably don't want to pick grapes, you know, low sugars because they're going to be so evolved. And they're pretty showy right away. I mean, you know, right after post-fermentation, you're tasting and go, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, so 6, 8 months, 9 months bottle time would be the way to go. Now, if you're picking at lower sugar, say 22, 22 and a half, and you have 8 grams or 9 grams of acid and pH of 3.2 or 3.1, it's almost like you're cooking at a lower temperature. It's like putting something in a crock pot for 12 hours. It's kind of slow and low, and it needs that barrel time. If you bottle it, say at 14 months or 16 months, it's unfinished.
Yeah.
It hasn't quite knitted itself together because it evolves so slowly. It requires less sulfur. If you're working in a reductive environment the way that I do, you're going to have really, really slow evolution because there's so little dissolved oxygen in those wines. And 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in barrel is certainly possible.
How much are you racking the wines as they age?
None.
Okay.
No, I think the key for us is always what goes on at the sorting table.
Okay.
Getting clean fruit, taking the time to pull out the mildew, the mold, the rot, any dirt, any garbage. In white wines, we cold settle.
Okay.
Usually using a small amount of bentonite just to settle out the mud that, when you have these clusters of grapes, there's just dirt on them. And so, in a 3,000 gallon tank of Chardonnay juice, you're going to have 75 to 100 gallons of just solid mud on the bottom. If you can separate that out, then you have a fairly clean ferment, and whatever yeast or remaining fine lees that's in that juice, because it doesn't completely settle out, is going to be the support system to carry that wine in barrel for a long period of time, because those yeast act like a sponge. They absorb oxygen, and they kind of grab all the garbage. And at some point you'll be, usually at 16 months, 17 months, you'll start to see stuff leak out of the lees, and you'll pick up some hydrogen sulfide, and then you can do a fine lees racking, and then go, 22, 24, 26 months, go to tank and bottle it unfined, unfiltered.
So you're not, it doesn't sound like you're stirring your lees
only
in
only in the early part, because we have a long, I prefer a long, slow malolactic. I'd like mallows to finish in the summer after harvest.
Okay.
So a good 7-8 months of just bubbling. And so not excessive stirring. We don't want to get that completely autolyzed character, but we want to release some carbon dioxide. So, sweeping the barrel with a stir will release some CO2 to act as a protection.
Okay.
We're topping more regularly, like every week early on, just to keep it protected and insulated, because there is no sulfur. And so, maybe our first sulfur addition could be, say, in June or May, after the harvest, and we'll do a 50-part addition. And then right at bottling, we'll look at what has gone to total and how much free is actually working, and adjust that to make to get it into a 0.8 molecular level, which is industry standards,
right, based on the pH of the
exactly.
wine.
And so a lot of times we'll find that the pH after malolactic will be, for Chardonnay, 3.25, 3.27. You're looking at, roughly 12 to 14 parts free. And in some cases you may be there. And so you won't have to make a sulfur addition. We'll also look at how much dissolved oxygen using an O2 meter. We can drop the probe down into the liquid and get a measure. And if I like to bottle wines with about 0.5 molecular. And if it's somewhere near 1, maybe, 0.8 or 1.2 or whatever, I can sparge that with nitrogen, slowly bubbling nitrogen into that tank, which will bind with the O2 molecules and just dissipate. So then I can lower the level, and then that will allow that wine to age and bottle for quite a long time. 12, 14, 20 years.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So a bottle of Burgundy was kind of your aha wine, right? That was what set you on this path?
yeah, I was a college student at UW, lived with two guys who were musicians. But Pat Woodland was studying classical guitar. Kent Torrey, who owns the Cheese Shop in Carmel, was an operatic singer. And the three of us rented a house together and lived together on campus. And they would have these Friday concerts, have people over to the house. Kent would cook stuff. And I was really more a beneficiary of their hospitality.
Yeah.
And so somewhere early on my freshman year, maybe like November, they were like, you're not really contributing much to the equation. So we're going to put you in charge of wine.
Okay.
And so, I can remember clearly walking up and down the aisles of Safeway looking for cool labels. And I came across, I believe it was an Almaden product called Jacare.
Okay.
And it was in this amphora-shaped bottle with this long neck and a reusable cork you could pull in and out.
Okay.
But the label had this sort of Urte figurine, looked like a 20s, flapper with
Kind of Art Deco.
yeah,
sort of
kind
thing.
of very Art Deco,
Yeah.
exactly. And they made a rosé, they made a white, and they made a red. And the three of us, not knowing really anything about wine, liked the red and the white. The white was probably primarily French Colombard from Cienega Valley. The rosé was probably some Cab Franc or whatever. And then I don't even know what the red wine was because we tasted it once and then we didn't like it.
Okay.
So, my job was to actually stand at the door. Would you like some Jacare?
Okay.
Jacare,
Yeah.
And I ended up getting a job working in a wine shop, Pike's Market. And that's where I really learned about wine. And then I think the first Pinot Noir I'd ever had was made by Larry from Acacia.
Okay.
And it was probably an 82 St. Clair vineyard. And I was like, wow, this is really impressive. And, Larry lives up here in the East Bay some part of the time. He's down in San Luis Obispo harvesting, but we talk often.
Oh, fun.
Because in some ways he was a big influence of me even thinking about Pinot Noir. At the time, Jordan Cabernet, 77, 78 Jordan Cabernets had just come out, and they were the kind of the rage. And obviously California was not known at all for Pinot Noir. And then there was certainly a lot more Cabernet and Chardonnay influences in California. But I, for whatever reason, liked this Pinot Noir. And so I continued to sort of investigate Bouchain, obviously Calera.
Yeah. Like Saintsbury?
Saintsbury later because Dick Ward and David Graves went to school with Dan Lee, and Dan Lee owns Morgan. So they were instrumental in my being able to make Pinot Noir because when I went to work for Dan Lee in 1984, he wanted to be a Chardonnay-only house, kind of like a Sonoma-Cutrer, Monterey County.
Yeah.
And I begged him to let me make Pinot Noir, and I would have these conversations with him about how we're going to have, whole cluster, hand sorted, traditional, foot treaded, unfined, unfiltered. And in those days, Pinot Noir was made like Cabernet. You beat the heck out of it, and it had long macerations. After fermentation, it would sit in contact with the skins for 2 or 3 weeks before it would get pressed, and it was bitter and horrible. And the reason behind that was in my last year of college, as an undergrad, a physician who I'd sold wine to gave me a bottle of Dujac's 78 Clos La Roche. And he said, at the time I was studying forensic chemistry and was going to be a physician.
Okay.
And when you go through medical school and you finish your residency, this will be a perfect bottle to celebrate, completion of your residency. And I was like, yeah, let's drink this sucker right now.
What better time than today?
Yeah, and it didn't take him too long to agree. And so I remember opening that bottle. It was kind of after hours, and there was two other guys that I worked with in the store and this physician, and I just literally levitated off the ground. It was the most incredible wine I'd ever experienced. And I thought, okay, that's what I want to do. I don't know how, I don't know where, but if you could make something like that for your friends, it would be incredible.
Yeah.
Very naive way of thinking, but I think as a 20-something, anything's possible.
Yeah.
And
it's time to do it.
I went back to University of Minnesota to start medical school, and this obviously before cell phones and before computers even. The only way to find out about a place to go learn how to make wine was going to the library and researching it out. And then I applied to Davis and was accepted in the graduate program, and dropped out of med school the following year and started studying at Davis Fermentation Science. And then while I was there, I ended up getting this job with Morgan.
Oh, while you were still at school?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So I was traveling back and forth, working for Dan and going back and forth to school. Yeah. And then eventually, it came time for a thesis, and I was like, I don't have time to do a thesis. So I never finished. And
really?
But then I just became a full-time winemaker. Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to school to get this job, but I already have the job.
Yeah. So, and you started at Morgan really 84, early on, right?
84. Morgan
second vintage or something.
Morgan
like
started
that,
in 82.
82.
So Dan made the 82 and 83, and then I came along in 84. And my first sort of winemaker role was really 85, 84 as assistant winemaker. 85, I was promoted a winemaker and made Chardonnay, and President Reagan gave that Chardonnay to Premier Mikhail Gorbachev at the Moscow Summit meeting in 1986. And that really kind of put Morgan on the map.
Okay.
Morgan had early success making Chardonnay in 82, 83, but the 85 Chardonnay really kind of brought kind of national attention because it was not just wine news. It wasn't getting, 2 puffs in Connoisseur's Guide or 3 puffs in Connoisseur's Guide.
Yeah.
It was because it was political news. It was AP and UPI, and it was in every newspaper.
Yeah, the New York Times.
It was everywhere.
And USA Today.
Yeah, all that
type
stuff.
Thing.
Yeah. President gives California wines as gift to Gorbachev, and I think it was Iron Horse sparkling wine, Mondavi Reserve Cab, and Morgan Chardonnay. And
wow. Okay.
Certainly Mondavi and Iron Horse had established reputations. They're like, who's this Morgan?
Yeah, so that brought just a lot more attention to the winery.
Broad spectrum of exposure for Morgan. And then I think because of that, Dan had been talking to David Graves and Dick Ward about me making Pinot Noir. And he was like, he's got all these crazy ideas, and I don't know if it's going to work. And and David said, give the kid a shot, And so Dan said to me, you can make 1,000 cases, and if it's crap, you don't ask me again. Okay. And so we started with Paraiso Springs Vineyard for Richard Smith, who since passed away, but became a really good friend. And the wine wasn't great.
Okay.
It wasn't even really good. But it got 90 points in the Spectator, which at the time was the highest score for any Morgan wine in the Spectator.
Okay. Okay.
So Dan was obligated to continue. And then we started to work with Stanley Ranch. And so we were making Pinot Noir from Monterey and then from Carneros.
Yeah.
And then we took some cuttings from Stanley Ranch and planted at Paraiso Springs. Okay. And we made a Monterey County, a Carneros, and then we made 2 reserve wines, kind of a barrel select from those.
Okay.
And then that just grew. Morgan, I think, became more known for Pinot Noir than Chardonnay by the time I left in 1994.
Those first years of it, that was mostly kind of reading up on Burgundian techniques in the library and taking what you could from Davis.
I mean, honestly, there was very little information. I mean, if you wanted to learn anything about a producer from Burgundy, you were either reading Clive Coates, Norm Remington, Hugh Johnson. You know, there wasn't internet yet. There wasn't cell phones yet. So it was reading very, very little information. There wasn't a lot of discussion about winemaking in those chapters.
Just kind of like gleaning, like little, like,
well, really just sort
there.
of trying to guess.
Okay.
Like, okay, well, what does this word pigeage mean? And then, okay, well, that's foot treading. Okay, well, that must be important. So we're gonna utilize that as opposed to pumping over or punching down. They don't have a destemmer. They do a lot of whole cluster. Okay, so that must be important. So we're gonna do that. But it was really a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
Because not understanding and going through all the sort of iterations of what must be good whole cluster winemaking, from waiting for stems to lignify,
right,
waiting for seeds to lignify, and then realizing that it really doesn't matter. But I remember as a young winemaker proclaiming how important that was, that you couldn't really harvest the grapes until the piece of stem that lignified off the cane had turned brown. Then that would mean that you would have less pyrazines and less of that bell pepper, kind of flavor in the wines. And it wasn't until I was in France and I asked Aubert de Villaine about it, and he looked at me like I had a third eye in my forehead, and he's like, his stems are always lime colored. And I was, oh, well, he does 100% whole cluster sometimes. So if Romanée Conti can be whole cluster and not taste, full of pyrazines, then that can't be the answer. And then I thought about it and I go, even if you have that little piece of stem lignified, what's inside the cluster itself, all of that that's attaching the berries is all still green.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was all brown, those things would be shriveled. So that can't be part of it. But understanding physiological ripeness as an important component to whole cluster fermentation really was the key. That you could have sweetness, you could be at a sugar level, but if all those pyrazines had not flipped over into sugars, you were going to have that sort of bell pepper, green herbaceousness in your whole cluster Pinot Noir.
Was there kind of just as much experimentation in the farming of Pinot at that time? Was it trying to people trying to figure it out?
That didn't come until later. I would say not until the 90s.
Okay.
Because clonal selections from Dijon started to show up in Oregon in the early 90s, like 90, 91, 92 clones like 667 and 777, 113, 14, and 15. And those started to migrate down into California. Prior to that, we had mostly heirloom clones, Martini clone, Swan clone, Calera clone, Wadenswil clone, which was a Swiss clone, and Pomard.
Okay.
UC Davis had done some heat treatments on a clone of Pomard, and there was Pomard 4 and Pomard 5. And so a lot of what was planted at Biennacido was Pomard 4 and 5 and a lot of Wadenswil.
Okay.
And then as new vineyards started to evolve, and there was really an explosion of Pinot Noir vineyards through the 90s, where we saw a lot more 667, 777,
Okay.
113, 114, 115. And then we started to look at trellising as a way to, and the people who were very, very committed to Pinot Noir were looking at ways to separate clusters, get uniformity in the clusters in the fruit zone. Gary Pizzoni was really one of the first vineyards that I worked with where he was insistent that he did a lot of things by the seat of his pants that even today wouldn't make any sense. But his commitment, it just, as a farmer, I think he understood how important it was that you position the clusters to be in this perfect straight line rather than up and down inside of the canopy. That you couldn't get uniform ripeness if you had mottling, if you had leaves shading those clusters. They would be behind a brick or two.
Yeah.
And so, people who would go to visit Pizzoni in the early mid-90s, 96, 97, before anybody knew about that vineyard, you would look down the aisle and it was be just a perfect line.
Wow. Yeah.
And every cluster looked perfect. This was a guy who had no experience with viticulture, you know, was a row crop farmer. His family, Eddie and Jane, his parents, had been farming 500-600 acres of vegetables for all of Gary's life. I mean, he grew up in a farming family. And it wasn't until his two sons went off to college, Mark to Davis, Jeff to Fresno, and then Mark went to Cornell for a master's in agriculture. Okay. And then Mark came back and took over the vineyards. And now things are being planted, at kind of the cutting edge level. And obviously Pizzoni had gone to a vertical shoot positioning before. It was just a simple bilateral cordon. Okay. But then they started putting catch wires in so that you could branch lock to keep those canes from flopping over and having clusters, sitting on top of each other. Yeah. Kathy Joseph at Fiddlesticks did the same thing when she planted her vineyard in 2001. And Biennacido was kind of a hodgepodge. Sleepy Hollow was a hodgepodge. But the newer vineyards were, viticulturally, systematically changing. Yeah. And now you're seeing that some of those old vineyards that are being replanted in a different way. Okay. Tighter spacing. It was pretty standard in the 80s to have 6x12 or 5x10 spacing. Okay. Wow. Because tractors were the size of Cadillacs. And so they would have the rows either 10 or 12 feet apart so that the tractors could drive down the middle. And then they would plant vines 5 or 6 feet from each other. And when I took over my Sleepy Hollow contract, I had been working with Sleepy Hollow since '84, and Morgan had a piece of it, but they had planted double L adjacent to Sleepy Hollow. And Dan called me and said, "We're giving up that contract, but I know you love this vineyard. Are you interested?" So I contacted Sam Balderas, who was the winemaker GM, and he said, "Yeah, you can have those pieces." So the first thing we did is we went in and we planted rows to cut the spacing to 5x5. Oh, okay. So between the 5x10, we just put a whole new row in. Wow. Okay. And for the early years, I did that in 97. In 99, we started to yield some early fruit off those young vines. And rather than integrating that into the old vine stuff, we negotiated contracts with top-end restaurants to take that young vine Chardonnay for by the glass. So we went to, for example, Jean George in New York and Bayona in New Orleans and Canlis in Seattle. And we would make that young vine stuff, bottle it under an Arcadian label, but use the name of the restaurant. So it would be an Arcadian-shaped, hexagonal label with Jean George and whatever their logo was.
Okay.
Like Bayona had an old indigenous woman sowing corn. And so that little woman was above Bayona, and then down in small letters, Arcadian, and the back label said produced and bottled by Arcadian. So they took up the bulk of all that young stuff for about the first 10 years that we were producing it. And then as those vines matured, we began to integrate a little bit of it back into the Sleepy Hollow label. So
tell me about leaving Morgan, because it seems like you kind of did I guess by nowadays it'd be kind of unusual kind of traveling after you've been making wine for 10 years. You went to Dujac for a couple years.
Yeah, I didn't have a passport.
Okay.
So, and nor did I have a real desire to travel. I was completely content experimenting and exploring, producing wine, and Morgan was enjoying a modicum of success and was growing. I think the first year I was there, we made 2,500 cases of wine. When I left, we were well into 70,000 cases of wine.
Okay, wow.
So, and we were making lots of different wines. Sauvignon Blanc. I was barrel fermenting Sauvignon Blanc from Healdsburg.
Okay.
Making Pinot Noir from Carneros and from Monterey, making Chardonnay from all over Monterey County, working with about 20 different vineyards, making Cabernet from Galante Vineyard, out in Carmel Valley, Syrah, even Viognier. And so, Morgan had kind of the chains had come off, and now we're making, every possible flavor.
Right. You think back to those days of fighting to be able to make a little bit of
Pinot Noir. Yeah. When we're only making Chardonnay. And Morgan had, a nice reputation. They were reasonably priced. They were expanding the market, being sold all over the U.S., into Canada, Mexico, Puerto Rico, some wine into the UK. And it wasn't the whole Dujac thing was really kind of just happenstance. I mean, I just didn't know this guy at all. I only read about him. He was just, an idol because he had made this incredibly amazing 78 Clos La Roche Pinot Noir that today still resonates with me. It was the sort of benchmark wine for me. And Jim Boswell, who was based in San Francisco and was the Sarug barrel broker for the U.S., would come down to visit me, and we would taste wines, and I would tell him how there was this guy, Jacques Cess, and I was just ripping him off. I was doing all these things, and and Jim would taste barrel samples, obviously, and I'm thinking, he's just wanting to sell me more barrels. What does a good barrel broker do? They entertain their clients. This is fantastic. This is incredible. It's unique. Nobody's doing anything like this. And I'm just soaking it up. I'm 26 years old. Yeah. So he would buy a case every year, a couple cases every year. And about 4 or 5 years into this dance, because I would see him every year, he'd come to the winery. to get a barrel order essentially and taste through barrels. And we'd say, okay, next year we want to get 50 Sarug, all yay. So he invited me to come to a barbecue at his house in San Francisco. And he said, bring your wine. I want to share it with some friends. And I said, sure. So grab a couple bottles. I head up to San Francisco and I'm at Jim's house and we're out in the backyard and there's barbecue going on. And he's like, okay, tell these guys about this wine. I really want them to. So, wine gets poured around. I'm standing in a group of 4 or 5 guys and I'm talking about Jacques says, this guy, he's just unbelievable, and this is how he whole cluster ferments his Pinot Noir, and he does traditional pesage, and he doesn't fine or filter, and the wines are just incredible. And I'm just going on waxing poetically about this individual who I've never met, but obviously idolize. And I see some smirks. I see a couple of smiles. And I realize that there's maybe a joke being played, but I don't have any idea about what this joke might be.
Okay.
And eventually, Jim breaks out into this big belly laugh. And he says, Joe, I want to introduce you to my brother-in-law, Jacques Sess. So I'd been literally standing this close, talking to this guy about him and how great I thought he was without even knowing who he was.
Wow.
And of course, I felt like a complete idiot. But he was such a gracious, kind, soft-spoken man. He said, I've been buying your wine for the last 3 or 4 years. So now I understand where those cases are going, and I really like them. And, you should be really proud of what you're doing, and you're on the right track, and just keep doing what you're doing. And I was, validation that I must be doing something right, maybe not exactly right, but something right, close enough. And, I remember feeling pretty elated about the experience. And so that began a dialogue where I would, again, at that time, send by fax.
Okay.
I'd draft a letter and fax it off to him, asking him questions, and then him responding back, or his wife, Roz, who was Jim's sister. So an American woman married to a French man.
Yeah.
And, and then starting little requests like, I would, if it's possible, I'd like to maybe get a magnum of Clos La Roche, which evolved into basically getting like a mixed case every year. And those wines were being sold by Chambers and Chambers.
Okay.
So they would ship those, and then I would come up to San Francisco and pick them up because I had paid directly by wire transfer to Roz and Jacques' bank. And so I would just come and pick them up. And they were in addition to whatever allocation Chambers and Chambers was getting. So they didn't really care.
Okay.
And that continued on. And then in early 2000s, I want to say 2003, 2004,
Okay.
I had been asked to chair a charity event in Birmingham for children with terminal diseases. It was kind of like a Make-A-Wish. Some ER doctors, Birmingham, Alabama has a very large children's hospital there.
Okay.
And some of the ER docs and oncologists wanted to create some sort of charity to raise money to help underwrite some of the expenses of 6-year-old kid, dealing with leukemia. And so they formed this nonprofit called Tum Tum Tree Foundation, and they would have a different winemaker, primarily from California, Oregon, come and be the chair. And then that chairperson, it was their responsibility as the honorary chair is to solicit other winemakers to donate bottles of wine, and there would be this live auction, and they would raise $600,000-$800,000. Wow. And so I had done that, and in fact, the board had contacted Jacques to procure a bottle of 78 Clos La Roche to give as a gift, and he agreed because it was for me. And he knew the story because I had told him the story. And he said, but I'm not going to ship it. Somebody will have to come and pick it up and hand carry it back. I only have several bottles remaining of that particular wine. And so two of the board members said, well, we'll go to France. And so they went over that summer. The auction is in November. And they brought it back and they presented me with that bottle.
Wow.
Which then went directly into an artist cellar to be painted.
Okay.
And I have yet to get it back.
Oh, no.
Yeah. There's a famous artist whose name shall remain unknown,
Okay.
Who is very famous for painting wine-only pictures. He's based in Atlanta. And he's painted Silver Oak and Far Niente, and and his pieces sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars, original oils. And so I asked him. He had painted an Arcadian piece, and he published a book, and he asked me to, write a foreword for it, which I did. And so as a request, I wanted him to paint this bottle of Dujac with a bottle of Max and a bottle of Francesca standing side by side, really kind of, this is the inspiration for creating these wines kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he said, happy to do it, but, I've got all of these consignments, so it'll have to wait. And so here we are, 20 years later, still haven't seen it.
Okay. Well, one day.
Yeah.
Sure.
But the point of that was to say the board of directors asked me that if they thought Jacques might be willing to come and be the chair the following year. And I said, I don't know. I can only ask. And so I sent a fax to Roz, and they decided to come. If you remember, there was this anti-French thing going on at that period of time where French fries became freedom fries.
Yeah.
Jacques and Roz decided they wanted to come, to kind of extend the olive branch to say we're not bad people, France,
Okay.
I don't even remember what the hullabaloo was all about back then, but I remember it was a very strong anti-French sentiment.
Right. I think it was something with the Iraq bombing, or
Perhaps
post September 11th.
Yeah,
the bombing and everything.
So he did come and hosted, and I was thrilled to introduce him, and we had lunch together with Frank Stidd, who was the chef of the restaurant where this event was taking place in Birmingham. So that was pretty exciting. How I came to be involved working there really was through an invitation.
Okay.
Because his Vigneron Christophe had been killed. He was on a scooter on the way to work, and somebody ran a stop sign and hit him. And so it was right before harvest. And so Roz sent me a fax asking me if I would come and help.
Okay.
And then I was like, okay, I'd been at Morgan for 10 years, and I had to go get a passport. And like, I moving to another country or going to work in another country for somebody who's never been out of the country is a daunting experience. And I thought, I don't really want to go. I mean, I'm completely content here, and my life is organized and simple. But if I don't go, I'll regret it the rest of my life. And so I resigned my position at Morgan, and off I went.
You were there for 2 years or so?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that really was an interesting time. I got comfortable living there. I didn't want to come back. Had a place to stay and a girlfriend and all that kind of stuff. And it was only that I couldn't get a green card. So my visa had expired a couple of times. At the time, France was trying to build a software industry, and they were giving most of the green cards to people who could write code. Okay. Not to winemakers.
They had enough.
They
They had
had
enough
plenty of
winemakers.
Yeah. So that really was the impetus to start Arcadian. I came back and took a job with Bernardus
Okay.
as their general manager for a year, just sort of saving some money to build up investment to be able to break out on my own. And that's what I did in 96. I took over, started Arcadian, leased 4 acres of Biennacido Chardonnay and made 500 cases worth of Chardonnay at Au Bon Clement Winery.
Okay.
And then moved into Central Coast Wine Services in 96. And then in 2006, moved into my own facility.
How did those first couple years go? Did kind of the recognition from Morgan, like, kind of travel with you a bit?
Yeah, certainly, releasing that first wine, I knew I wouldn't have difficulty selling that. I had, through my 10 years of working at Morgan, had been working in the market because Dan and I kind of split the country. He covered all of the Northeast. I had kind of the South.
Okay.
Atlanta, Louisiana, Alabama, the Carolinas, Florida. So I had contacts there. I mean, distributors who were representing Morgan. Hey, I've got my own little project. Would you be interested? And so I signed on with all of those distributors, RNDC in Florida, Atlanta Wholesale Wine in Georgia, International Wines in Alabama. And so that wine went out quickly. And in 97, I added Pinot Noir from Sleepy Hollow and Biennacido and Pizzoni.
Okay.
And in 98, I added Chardonnay from Sleepy Hollow. In 99, I added Syrah from Gary's Vineyard. 2000, added Gary's Vineyard Pinot Noir, added Syrah from Westerly, and then eventually Fiddlesticks came along in 2001, Deerberg in 2002, Sleepy Hollow, Syrah in 2002, Stoltman and Purisma in 2004, 2005. So that became kind of the portfolio of wines. We made 2 Chardonnays, Biennacido initially, and then we just jumped over to Sierra Madre.
Okay.
And then continued to make Sleepy Hollow. So we made 2 Chardonnays and probably 6 or 7 Pinot Noirs and 3 or 4 Syrahs.
Did your winemaking change, you feel like, after that time at Dujac, and kind of seeing what you had read about in person? Or
no, the winemaking didn't change at all.
Okay.
What changed was the farming.
Okay.
So, what's different about America and Europe is that we in America, we diversify everything. There's not a regular doctor. You see 40 specialists.
Yeah.
If you got an earache, you go to the ear, nose, and throat guy. If your butt hurts, you go to the proctologist. If your arm hurts, you see the orthopedic guy. You just don't go see one doctor. And the same concept, kind of exists throughout all facets of industry. If you're, a lawyer, you practice construction law, you litigator, you real estate law,
Right.
You specialize. And that's exactly what happens in the field of winemaking. We have to choose whether going into viticulture or into fermentation science. You get a class or 2 on each. So the guys that do the farming know a little bit about winemaking. The guys that know winemaking know a little bit about farming, but we don't integrate those things. And so most wineries in California, you have a winemaker, an assistant winemaker, a cellar manager, you have a viticulturist or vineyard manager, an assistant vineyard manager, and that creates this friction. You send a vineyard manager and a winemaker out to sample, the vineyard guy is always going to be 2 bricks higher than the winemaker. And so this guy wants to pick and this guy wants to wait. And that becomes the push-pull every harvest for every winery. There's always this. In France, you have one guy who does all the farming. He has people that work with him, but he does all the farming and all the winemaking. And he is a vigneron, which means essentially wine grower, not winemaker, not vineyard manager, but wine grower. And the concept appealed to me in a very, very profound way because as a wine grower, you're looking at the big picture. You're looking at from harvest all the way through to the next harvest. And as a winemaker, you're looking from only halfway. And then the vineyard guy is looking the other half. So I don't really care as a winemaker when you prune or what your spray schedule is or when you're pressure bombing or when you're hedging. I don't really focus on that because I'm just focusing on what's happening in the cellar, when we're topping, if there's this bacteria spoilage, do I need to address any pressures? When are we going to bottle? How do we get glass? When can we get the bottling line scheduled?
Yeah.
So it's a very, very compartmentalized way of thinking about making wine. And when you are in the vineyard and you are making those decisions, you're making those decisions with the idea in mind of how is this wine going to taste? It's really, that ultimate farm to table concept of like every little thing that I do all along the way in the vineyard is going to impact how that wine tastes and how it ends up on the table and is experienced by the people who are consuming it. And for me, that was a profound revelation. And so when I came back to start Arcadian, I came back with the idea of not buying grapes by the ton, but setting up acreage contracts.
Okay.
Which was an unheard of idea.
I was going to ask you if that was something that was new.
Didn't exist. I mean, there were certainly semblances of it. For example, Joe Heights would buy all of Martha's vineyard. All the fruit went to him. Right. How active or involved he was in the farming of those grapes, I don't know. But this concept, this idea of like saying to you as a farmer, look, I know it's going to cost you about $5,000 an acre to farm that. Your labor costs, all of the materials you use to manage that vineyard, the tractor you're running, all of that, when it all ends said and done, comes out to about $5,000 an acre. So if you're 10 acres, times 5,000. And then you're going to farm 3 tons to the acre, maybe 4 or 5 tons to the acre, depending on how you're going to push your profit. And if you're going to sell that at 3,000 a ton or 2,000 a ton or 5,000 a ton, depends on what you're looking for your gross profit to be minus your farming costs. How about I just pay you the profit and I assume the farming costs?
Okay.
So you get that $5,000. Let's say you're going to farm to 3 tons to the acre and you're going to charge me $2,200 a ton. That's $6,600. I give you a check for $6,600. Then I assume all the risk. I mean, if the grapes rot or if deer eat them all, it's all on me. You get to go, to Mexico and drink a Corona because I'm assuming the risk. But by assuming the risk, I get all the control. So that's how I was able to just go along and interplant at Sleepy Hollow. That's how I was to change water regime. For example, the guy below me or the guy above me might want to have a lot more water. And so I could put shutoff valves So the water would bypass my 2-acre parcel
Okay.
and not get watered because I was farming to lower yields. I was setting the clusters, 1 cluster per shoot, 2 clusters per shoot instead of 3 or 4 clusters per shoot.
Are you working with your own farming team?
Yeah.
In that case,
in
generally?
in some cases, I would hire some of the existing vineyards crew. You know, at Sierra Madre, Doug Circle had a crew. I'd say, give me 5 guys and I'll pay them cash on the barrel directly. So they're going to get paid for the days that they work for me. And so it's just coordinating with the vineyard manager to be able to clear up those 5 guys to work on my section for, and then my cellar master, myself, we're there, show this is what we want to do and this is how we're going to do it. Once you show somebody how to do it, then okay, no problem, you know. And anybody who came to work for me, their first 6 or 8 months stage was exclusively in the vineyard.
Okay.
So, for example, Justin Willett at Tyler, Paul Lotto, Chad Melville, Ben Kane, Xavier, and all those guys went on to have their own wineries, but all of them were at the Arcadian School learning farming.
Yeah.
So they were in the vineyard every day for the first 6 or 8 months of their employment.
Okay.
Running the crews, so that if I was traveling, if I was out on the road selling, then I knew that I had my guys in addition to somebody else's guys running the show.
Yeah.
So those contracts allowed for us to have much more autonomy and control of what we were getting, and ultimately it leads to the argument of, is wine made in the vineyard or made in the winery? And, we would always come down on the side of the vineyard, because if you did 90% of the work in the vineyard, you only had 10% of the work in the cellar. If you did 10% work in vineyard, then 90% of the work had to go on in the cellar.
Yeah.
And I sat on many panels debating that issue with them.
How differently did you find yourself treating each of these vineyards for either Chardonnay or Pinot, as far as, do you tend to use similar amounts of whole cluster for each vineyard, or is it very pH and year?
Yeah, the idea philosophically is to try to be consistent, so that that's not an intervening variable. That if you're trying to, let's say the trial is, we want to see only the expression of the site. If we do something different here than we do in this vineyard, then that could have an impact. So as much as we possibly realistically could do that, we tried to be very consistent across the board in terms of barrels that we chose. Early on in my career, I bought barrels from everybody.
Okay.
I must have had 25 different Coopers at Morgan, using 5-6 different forests, different toast level. It was what the French call essentially the spice rack approach.
Okay. Even for just Pinot?
For Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, for everything.
Okay. Yeah.
Mostly because I don't know what the difference between a Francois Frere barrel is and a Sarug barrel in 1984 or 1985. I don't know how Riemann's Trancé barrel changes the flavor profile of Sleepy Hollow Chardonnay when compared to another forest and another barrel cooper. And over the course of that 10-year experience, certain barrels began to sort of rise to the surface in my subjective preference.
Okay.
And so when I started Arcadian, I knew that Dujac used exclusively Riemann barrels and that DRC used exclusively Francois Frere barrels. But what I noticed was that every producer only had one Cooper in their cellar.
Okay.
And I asked Jacques about that, why he preferred Rimon and why he only used Rimon, Tronchet, for example. And he said, I never understood why American wineries would use all these different barrels. If you're making soup, you don't put the cinnamon and the thyme and the rosemary and the curry and the oregano all in the soup. You use one spice or two spice to enhance the soup, but putting all the spices in the soup is crazy. You have this Cooper as a heavy toast and this Cooper is a light toast. You're just kind of going to the middle. You're not really, and so it never made sense to him, and that made sense to me. I was like, yeah, I never thought of it that way. I know that part of the reason I used all those barrels was to learn what each barrel did, because I would, for example, in a Sleepy Hollow block from Morgan, where we might have 100 barrels of Sleepy Hollow Chardonnay, there was at least one new barrel from each one of those Coopers so that I could taste it. Okay. It was easier to delineate the distinctions of each new barrel in white wine as opposed to, Pinot Noir or Syrah or something like that, or Cabernet. But in Chardonnay, as a neutral grape, you could really see the difference when you took samples of all those barrels and set them on the table and you smelled and tasted them. You could see really distinctive differences.
Yeah. So over time, you just started kind of honing in
exactly
on what you liked.
Yeah. And Francois Frere was a very distinctive barrel. It was a very popular barrel. Jim and Bob at Aubin Clement and Coupé used exclusively Francois Frere. It's a very potent spice. And for me, thinking about stylistically what I wanted to accomplish, which was to make wines that exuded elegance rather than broad shoulders, powerful wines, really more elegant wines, because I felt Pinot Noir and Chardonnay really sort of fit more of a feminine mold than, say, Syrah or Cabernet. And Cîroc for me always sort of exuded that. It had the sort of least aromatic influence, but somehow also elongated the finish. If you had Sleepy Hollow Chardonnay and a Francois Frere barrel and a Rimon barrel and a Dargaud and Jaegler barrel and a Latour barrel, of all the barrels, Cîroc had the longest finish. Even objectively, you're tasting that wine longer than any of those other barrels, which some of them had a more truncated finish. They might be more intense in the nose aromatically, like the Francois Frere is like, that's big, powerful.
Yeah.
And so I almost went exclusively to Cîroc. I think in 96 and 97, I could only get a certain amount of Cîroc, and so I used some Francois Frere. But after 97, whatever Francois Frere had, I stuck around, but I was only buying from Cîroc.
How much new oak did you generally like to use on?
Initially 100%, because back then we didn't have the systems to sanitize barrels in a very consistent way. There wasn't, ozone machines were just coming on the scene. Steam machines weren't around yet. And so you had to use chemical agents to kill bacteria. So if you were buying barrels from other people, you're getting their bacteria in your cellar. And so I wanted to keep it as clean as possible. And so we would only buy new barrels. And then little by little, we were buying less new. And then we ended up probably in 2005 buying a steamer and using a steamer as a way to sanitize our own barrels. But we never bought barrels from anybody else. We just kept our own barrels. So the barrels I bought that were new in 96 and 97 and 98 stayed in the winery,
Yeah.
forever.
Okay.
We never sold
Yeah.
barrels.
Oh, no. Okay.
No, we never sold them. We just kept them.
Okay.
And if a barrel was a problem, if there was a leak or something we couldn't fix, then we just made firewood out of it. We tore it down.
Yeah.
So,
Well, to ask you, you kind of touched on it at the very beginning, but longer aging, especially on the Pinot Noirs, how did that kind of affect you in the market? If it did, just maybe having, I guess, a wine for sale that's maybe 3 years older than
yeah, I'm sure.
most wines on the market. Was there any backlash ever,
I think we developed fairly quickly a reputation. I think most high-end restaurants, somms, and savvy retail buyers appreciated the fact that it wasn't another 2010 when they'd already tasted 20 of them. They were getting a 2007
Yeah.
or 2005. Restaurants loved it because it created diversity on their wine lists. You see, I think in retail it was where it most impacted us.
Okay.
Because retailers want the newest, latest,
Yeah.
fresh off the press, picked on in September and it's here in October,
Yeah.
They really wanted the newest releases, where retailers were looking to backfill. Like, I'm Pinot-centric winery and I've got 20 Pinot Noirs on the list and 18 of them are all from the same vintage.
At restaurants, you mean?
Yeah, right. So, if you go out to a restaurant and you're looking
Yeah.
at a wine list and you see an older back vintage of wine, it piques your interest. You're certainly going to look at that. Let's say, all the wines are 2010s, but you see a 2000 Pizzoni on the list and it's $175, where the 2010 is $90 or $100, and you're going, okay, for $60 more, I'm getting a 10-year-old Pizzoni Pinot Noir from Arcadian. And some of the top restaurants, particularly in New York, the Danny Myers group, they did a separate Arcadian page.
Oh,
And
really?
and so they would actually, I'd get a request list to backfill wines that they didn't have. They wanted to sort of maintain these verticals of Pizzoni and Sleepy Hollow and Fiddlesticks, and so they'd sell out of the 2002. And do you have any more 2002?
Yeah.
And so they, I'd send them maybe 2 cases of mix. They'd have 3 of this and 1 of those and 2 of those, and they'd get shipped off to my distributor, and then he'd deliver them directly
Okay.
to the winery, whether it was Gramercy Tavern or wherever restaurant that they had. And then Windows of the World wanted to do that, and so they created a separate Arcadian page, and we started to see more and more of that,
Okay.
where people began to understand that older Arcadian wines were better expressions of the wine themselves than the newer versions. So I don't know that it affected. I know that winemakers would say, "How are you doing this? We could barely afford to
Yeah.
keep the wheels on the bus selling last year's wine." And the way that we did it was we took a $2 million line of credit from Farm Credit Bank
Okay.
to steamroll those first 4 or 5 vintages. And once you have that inventory built up, then you're releasing a vintage and making a vintage and releasing a vintage. But you had to carry that note on that $2 million and make sure you're making enough to pay the interest on those and be down on the line of credit. And we were with Farm Credit for 20 some years, and every year we would have a meeting. And Joe Green would say, are we building inventory still, or are we going to sell some shit this year? And the challenge for them was most actuaries would write off anything that was older than 3 years.
Okay.
They'd say, if it's 2010 and this is 2005, it's too old. It has no value, because most wineries, it didn't. Mm-hmm. In our case, we had to argue our case and show that we had sold, $200,000 worth of wine that you valued at zero.
Right.
And so eventually, as a way of maintaining that line of credit and having enough collateral to cover that loan, they would say, okay, how many cases did you sell to make that 200,000? And then they would divide that 200,000 by the number of cases and say, okay, all these wines are valued at this price based on what you've sold.
Yeah, you're just starting to sell some wines. Well, when other wineries are kind of having the fire sale and a vintage fire sale, trying to shove the last cases out the door of something.
Yeah, most wineries have, one vintage in barrel and one vintage in bottle. Mm-hmm. And they might have some previous vintage stuff straggling along. And in some cases, particularly in Napa Valley, they would have back vintages of Cabernet, because Cabernet, if you had it was 10 years old, that was okay. But if it was Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, it was not okay.
Yeah.
And particularly Chardonnay. It's like, we can't value that. It's can't be valued. It's Chardonnay. And I'd have to actually break it down and say, okay, we sold X number of cases of 2001 Sleepy Hollow and X number of cases of 2002 Sierra Madre. So
yeah,
it has value.
Is there a wine through your career that you're particularly proud of?
It's probably the most often asked question that I get.
Okay.
And for sentimental reasons only, the wines that I make for my children, Francesca Pinot Noir and Hommage Max, which are a sort of a different entity, in that as a winemaker who's making vineyard-only designated wines, you are trying to step back from creating a heavy fingerprint on that wine. That you want Sleepy Hollow to always show as Sleepy Hollow, and is very distinctive from Deerberg, which is very different from Bozzoni or Gary's or Fiddlesticks. And that you could taste all those wines and see clearly the differences. They weren't sort of the same. They were dramatically different. They had different components. Fiddlesticks always had bigger tannins because of all the rock that was there. And Sleepy Hollow was always soft and supple and lush because it was basically sand.
Yeah.
And those vineyard expressions were important to me. But in the case of the two wines that I made for my children, I wanted those wines to reflect how I saw them as people.
Okay.
So, when you having a daughter who's maybe 2 years old and is just a bundle of sweetness and love, you want the expression of that wine to reflect that characteristic of her. So you're making choices about the barrels and the percentages of the barrel. Maybe you're only taking 10% from this barrel and 5 gallons from that barrel to create this blend. And it was always a year-long puzzle. It never, the final composition never was determined until right before bottling. But the whole time those wines are in barrel, I'm looking at thousands of combinations and permutations to see if I can create a wine that expresses my perception of who my daughter is or who my son is. And that's very different concept than making these vineyard designated wines that are expressions of the site themselves. So for me, that was a lot more energy and effort, but it was like I've been given these colors to paint a picture, and so I'm painting that picture where these are all sort of predetermined.
Yeah.
That the barrels that go into them, the yeast that I use, the percentage of whole cluster, the length of time, they were all being bottled the same time within a day.
Right.
So the variables were consistent.
Yeah.
This was a whole different concept.
Yeah.
And I always felt gratified if I achieved that goal, if that my perception of the expression was just exactly what I had hoped to accomplish. So I was always gratified by those. There have been wines throughout my career that have really stood out, not for what I did, but for the circumstances or the conditions.
Okay.
2005 was, in my estimation, one of the greatest vintages in California, particularly the Central Coast, primarily because we had come through some years of drought in 2003, 2004. And in 2005, there was about 39 inches of rain, which typically annual rainfall was about 12 to 14. So we had more rain in 2005 than we ever had, and it came at the right time. It came when the vines were dormant. And what happens when you grow grapes in a drought condition is you build up salt deposits around the roots themselves.
Okay.
And so those roots have these little valves that open and close that let water in and nutrients and minerals in to feed the plants. And they get plugged up by these salts. They get a little bit clogged, almost like a clogged valve.
Yeah.
And so the throughput is at a much slower rate because the window's only halfway open.
Yeah. Okay.
And so you create fruit that's out of balance because you still have the sunshine every day. So you're getting photosynthesis and respiration and sugars increasing, but the physiological development is behind and lagging. And it doesn't mean you can't make good wines in drought situations, but oftentimes there's issues to deal with, flaws, things are out of balance. So 2005, everything is in perfect condition, and things were ready to harvest at much lower sugars. If you went through and looked at producers who typically pick really ripe style wines, probably the lowest alcohol vintage for them was in 2005.
Okay.
People who had normally made, Pinot Noir that was 14.5 or 15% were suddenly at 13%. Because they were out tasting those grapes, and these are delicious and perfect. They're ready to pick, and they might be 23 or 22.5 instead of 24 or 25 or 28, whatever. And so the 2005 vintage really across the board made incredible wines. 2006 and 2007 were just benefactors of that rain washing away all that salt that had amassed over time around those roots. That all got washed away. So everything is working perfectly. It's like somebody gave the plants Lipitor, and now everything's flowing beautifully. So those vintages were all really, really grand vintages in slightly different ways for slightly different reasons. 2007 was lush right from the very get-go. The wines were pretty and opulent and ready to drink early on, where the 05s needed more time, 06 needed more time, the 07s, you drink those waiting for the 05s to evolve. 2001 was a really great vintage as well. I probably have had more comments or more people have written about 2001 Gary's Vineyard Pinot Noir and 2001 Sleepy Hollow Pinot Noir than maybe just about any other wine I'd ever made.
Wow. Okay.
And even still today, those wines are really spectacular.
Still drinking well.
Yeah, it's still as good as they were 15 years ago.
Wow. I want to ask you about making Syrah and when you decided to kind of take the jump from, I guess, strictly Burgundian
Yeah,
varietals? And
that came about as I had a group of investors based in Atlanta. Bob Fleming, who is an attorney in Atlanta, was a big fan of Rhone wines. And often in our annual donors or investors meeting, the subject of Rhone wines would come up. And, you know, his perspective was you're kind of like right in the heart of some of the best Syrah grown in California. You have Bob Lindquist down the street and Joey Tinsley down the street. You have John Albin up the road and Saxum's up the road. And there's a lot of guys making incredible Syrah. And, you know, we think you could make incredible Syrah too. So I said to Bob, okay, I'll make a small amount. And if I don't sell it, you have to buy it all. And he says, I'll buy it all if you can't sell it. So it's like, okay, this is a safe bet. And so I talked to Gary Francione about planting 5 acres of Syrah at Gary's vineyard. And we took cuttings from Bob Lindquist's hillside property and planted it. And Adam Tolmach from Ojai and myself made Syrah from Gary's vineyard. And the first vintage was 1999, and it actually turned out to be a really incredible wine. And so then we weren't really on the hunt for Syrah, but then people kind of would come to me and say, you know, I've got this Syrah block. Are you interested in it? Jeff Newton from Coastal Vineyard Care said the people that own Westerly, they have 3 little plateaus that are unbelievable, and they're not going to make as much Syrah this year. Are you interested? And I went out and took a look at it, and I said, yeah, I'm interested in these 3 little plateaus. They're kind of like the hill slooped up, and they were like 1 acre or half an acre, sitting about 400 or 500 feet above the rest of the vineyard. It was really kind of
interesting.
So you had to kind of go up this road to get up to this piece.
Yeah.
And so we took those 3 plateaus and we made Westerly. You know, the guys at Purissima, Steve Beckman's son Jasper went to school with my daughter Francesca, and they went to a little private school that was out in the country, and little dirt parking lot, and we were dropping the kids off from school, and Steve walked over to my car and he says, you know, I hear that you are making some Stoltman Syrah this year. And I said, well, I'm considering it. I haven't signed the contract yet, but negotiating to get a piece of the Sine Qua Non block. And he said, well, why didn't you ever ask me about my vineyard? And I said, well, Steve, I didn't think you had any available, tell you the truth. And he goes, well, for you, I do. And I said, well, all right, well, let's go take a look. And so we left the parking lot, you know, at 7:30 in the morning, drove up to the vineyard, and I rode around in a gator with him. And I said, you know, I like this piece up at the top that's at 1,200 feet because I can see Santa Rita Hills. I feel the breeze. I think this Syrah would be almost a cool climate Syrah. And he said, well, I can't give it all of it. I said, well, what do you have? He says, well, I can give you an acre of the 174 clone. And I said, okay. And then we drove down into the middle, and he had a block of Tablas Creek clone that he had planted in 99. And he was keeping that for himself. And I said, well, I would certainly like to have some of that. And he's like, well, that's not for sale. I said, well, then what are we doing here? You know, you told me he had some fruit. And he said, well, not that. And I said, well, then I'm not interested. And he goes, well, okay, how much do you want? I said, well, how much you got there? And he goes, I don't have any for sale. I said, all right, tell you what, I'll take an acre up on the top and an acre here. Otherwise, I'm out. And he goes, okay, I'll give you an acre.
Okay.
But you don't tell anybody where it is, because I've already told Bob he can't have it. I've told Manfred he can't have it.
Okay.
So I said, well, you know, I promise that I'll just say it's Purissima. It was Clone 99 from Topless, 1 acre, and 174 from on top. So I started with that in, I think, 2005.
Okay.
And so now I'm making Purissima, Stolman, Westerly out in Happy Canyon, and Gary's and Sleepy Hollow up in Santa Rita Hills.
It comes on fast.
Yeah, so now all of a sudden making 5 different
Yeah.
Syrahs. You know, not a substantial amount, 300 or 400 cases of each, but you know, Syrah was not the easiest varietal to sell.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a challenge.
Did you tend to treat that similar to Pinot Noir?
So all 100% whole cluster. I'd never co-fermented. I was always 100% Syrah. You know, the barrels were mostly used barrels. It was older Pinot Noir barrels got rolled into the Syrah. I never did new barrels really. I would set aside a few new barrels and would leave them empty, just leave them sitting there.
Okay.
And as I started to create the formation of what would become Homage and Max, I might separate those pieces and put into those new barrels.
Okay.
And so that the Homage and Max might get a little bit of new barrel influence as opposed to all the other single vineyards which had no new wood in them.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and that was always I would have conversations with Bob. Syrah loves new oak, man. You should be doing 100% new oak. I mean, it just loves new barrels. And I'm like, well, if I could sell Syrah for the same price of Pinot Noir, I'd probably put some more new barrels in there.
Not as easy to get rid of it, huh?
Well, it's easy to sort of cycle out older Pinot Noir barrels into Syrah and not buy a bunch of new wood because, you know, selling Syrah at $50 a bottle was no small feat.
Yeah.
You know, I could sell Sleepy Hollow Syrah at $35 or $40, but the Stoltman and Purissima were always, you know, $55. Gary's was always $60 or $65 because those grapes were as expensive as the Pinot Noir.
Was there ever a point where you thought about buying a vineyard?
Never, because I knew I could never afford it.
Okay.
I mean, the way I was making wine and the return on the investment was so expanded out that you know there was always just enough capital to keep the lights on and pay all the bills, but never a surplus of capital to invest into something such as a vineyard.
Yeah.
I think, you know, for anybody who's starting out, the quickest way to return on the investment is to lease everything. You know, rent a building, rent the vineyards. You can't rent the barrels, but you can, on the big capital expenditures, you can sort of lease those and pay as you go, as opposed to just putting an investment
Yeah.
in it. But, I mean, if you had the money, then sure, it would make a lot of sense to plant a property that you could, from the ground up, have every single control of. But we just never found ourselves in that position to be able to do that.
Yeah. I was just curious. I was going to ask you what the status of Arcadian and what you're currently doing.
So good question. So in 2018, couple sort of profound things happened. One, a realization that my children were going off to college, and that two people who had been such an integral part of my life were suddenly going to be gone. And that I was, as a parent, going to be lucky enough to see them twice a year, as opposed to every single day. Yeah. And being very active in my children's life, my son, I coached his soccer team and his basketball team and his baseball team. And, you know, went to all the dance recitals and plays that my daughter was involved with. And it was a sort of a rude awakening, waking up and thinking to myself that this is going to be an empty house, and deciding that I wanted to spend as much possible time as I could with them before that happened. And neither one of them wanted to take up the reins. My daughter wanted to go to law school and wanted to be involved in international charity. And my son wanted to pursue sports. And so an opportunity, mother and son came looking to buy the winery, and we negotiated for them to sort of buy everything that I had except the inventory and the trademark.
Okay.
That I wasn't going to sell Arcadian, which they were fine with. They wanted to create their own thing.
Okay.
And they weren't really interested in the inventory because they wanted to make Syrah, and they wanted to be, Sine qua non. So stylistically, very different varietals, different wines, making a lot more Grenache and Mourvèdre and Roussanne and Marsanne rather than Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. We were just right location for them.
Yeah.
And so I sold that, closed the winery, and started to travel back and forth to Boston to visit my kids. My daughter was going to Northeastern at the time. Max is going to be pursuing sports business at UMass Amherst. And he bubbled with me that first year of COVID, his senior year of high school. So, there was a lot of every day at the gym.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot to do. It was going to the bank, going to the grocery store, going to the gym, but spending that time with him every single day. And then my dad was getting older, and I wanted to travel with him. I asked him to create a bucket list of places he wanted to see. And he always wanted to go to Niagara Falls, to Cooperstown, to the Boxing Hall of Fame.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So we traveled, he and I, and he's still at 90 wants to travel. He just came back from Yellowstone in Montana with my brother.
Awesome.
And I'm at a point in my life where I dearly miss the process. That I don't miss the challenges of being an owner and figuring out how to pay Peter and Paul and keep the lights on, particularly in this current environment where everybody's, in dire straits. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
The wineries that are buying fruit today will not be around next year. Because the tariffs are paying a horrible toll. I mean, the reality is that the American wine industry as a separate entity can't survive without international wine. The Spanish wine, the French wine, the Italian wine, the German wines pull American wine through the marketplace. If we can only drink American wine in this country, that industry will die a slow death. And we're seeing that march to the gallows now, which is horrible. I'm optimistic that it will somehow survive, but it doesn't look very pretty at the moment. So not a good time to start a winery.
Yeah.
So, but I would love to make wine, and I would love to work in a vineyard because I have been doing that for 40 plus years. And it's for me pleasure. The experiences in my life of taking my infant and bundling her up and taking a diaper bag and bottles of breast milk to the vineyard and strapping her in a, chest thing while I'm driving the tractor at Biennacido at 6:30 in the morning,
Yeah.
listening to Winnie the Pooh. This is an incredible, experience to have that pleasure and that joy of family and work come together. You know, watching a red-tailed hawk circling looking for rabbits in the vineyard at sunrise or sunset and not hearing a car sound anywhere, just the bump 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 of a diesel tractor. It was as romantic can be for me. Being in the cellar working with the team at harvest, it's almost like showing up to a fire and you have a finite amount of time to make everything work, and doing so in concert with other people where everything works smoothly, that it really isn't a fire drill, that everybody knows what to do, and that we're all working together to create a successful entity. To look back at that, in the early years, when we were at Central Coast Wine Services, I loved hosting lunches. We would shut the winery down for 2 hours and we'd have 60 or 70 people because there was probably 100 different wineries working out of Central Coast. So you'd have Mike Monacorsi and the Hitching Post guys and the Red Car guys and, Steve Dooley. And they would all come to our table with their cellar crews. And we'd have this long table and we would just massive amounts of wine. I would set aside about $15,000 to buy harvest wine, so that if we were making Chardonnay, we were drinking Chardonnay from South Africa, from Australia, from Burgundy, Batard, Sassans, Polinis, Cortons, along with some of the best producers from South Africa and from Australia. Is to have and invite and create that discussion about Chardonnay and what we see in those wines and what appeals to them and how will they influence the way that we're potentially making Chardonnay here. And you have all of these people who are, maybe it's their second harvest, maybe their first harvest. They're there for 6 or 7 weeks from different countries. Sharing that kind of energy was always very invigorating for me to see, just to hear and listen, to sit around a table watching these people who maybe have never had a bottle of, Ramonet ever or Ravenot ever, and to experience it for the first time and to see their eyes light up and understand why that's a great wine. And for other winemakers to chip in, to bring equally grand bottles of wine, to say, thanks for hosting this lunch. And it may have been, something as simple as a large thing of cheeses and fresh bread and pozole because it's cold in the morning, whatever it may have been. But something we would do is sit around and talk about the wines for a couple of hours because we knew we were going to be there till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, crushing grapes or racking wines or filling barrels or cleaning the winery up. I miss that. I miss that camaraderie. I think I'm at a point in my life where I want to be more of a Yoda than a Jedi Knight, to share the benefits of that 40 harvests that I have experienced to help people maybe have a sharper learning curve to get to the point they want to get to quicker by providing the benefit of my experience. So I'm not so sure I want to hang a shingle and be a consultant. But if somebody wants to hire me to work for them, or whether I go to work working again, making wine, just because the pleasure of doing that process, wherever that may be. And that's kind of what I'm looking around to consider maybe doing now. But, it's been 5 years.
Yeah.
Coming up on 6 years. And the first few years were great. I didn't have to go to work or think about it. But now I'm starting to get bored.
Yeah.
And I'm 67. I think I've probably got 10 or 12 good harvests in me left. And so we'll see what happens. But that's kind of where it is. In the meantime, when I closed the shop, I had probably 3.5 million, 4 million in inventory, something like that, of library wine going back to 97.
Wow.
Things that I had designated to be the library of Arcadian, where we were setting aside 10%, 20% of the total production to not be sold. Now it's like, okay, well, if we got this warehouse full of wine, I can live off that, short of what has been set aside for both of my children.
Yeah.
There's plenty of inventory. And so there are consumers directly that reach out via email that say, I've had this. Do you have any more of that? Is it possible to get it? And so we're starting to dwindle down now after 5 years of selling library stuff, which is an impetus to want to get back to work and have a paycheck coming in every day rather than relying just on, people sort of willy-nilly ordering or sending email. I mean, this restaurant that I met with yesterday, I just got an email from Jason out of the blue saying, hey, we're setting up a new shop here. We want to add Arcadian to the mix. What do you have available? And so I sent him a list of things, and I said, I'll come by and see. I want to see what you're doing. And so we had lunch, and I opened up a few bottles of wine for them. Like, oh, we'll take this, we'll take this, and we'll take that.
Yeah.
So we had 2003 Hommage Max, 08 Francesca, 2013 Clos Pépichard.
Right.
And they bought all of them. So, that's kind of what I've been doing.
Right. Is there anything that we missed or you'd like to add or anything?
I could sit around probably chatting and telling you stories of things.
Stories are always good.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to do a few Arcadian chapters.
Thanks for listening today. Joe has made such amazing wines in his career, and I love sitting down and hearing some of the stories from before my time. We happened to meet randomly at a dinner, and the stories I heard that night were so interesting. The Arcadian wines I've tried lately are drinking wonderfully. The website is still up, arcadianwinery.com. Hopefully Joe continues to make some great new wines. Please follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast helps a lot too. There's also Venmo for one-time donations if you don't want another subscription. I understand that. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses, keeps it ad-free, available for everyone, and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.